When one considers the probable deleterious effect unregulated campaign financing has had and is having on the electoral affairs and, by extension, the governance of Trinidad and Tobago, one of the literary works of the great bard comes to mind. Not Sparrow's, but Shakespeare's. The Shakespearean comedy Twelfth Night, the only play of the 33 credited to his name, which is given an alternative title by the author, namely What You Will, portrays images of a topsy-turvy world in which weighty matters and circumstances are conjoined incomprehensibly with flippancy, hypocrisy, and manifest insanity. The alternative title of the play suggesting a carnival world where everything is masquerade. How appropriate, how sad. For when it is considered that the Representation of the People's Act, Chapter 201, permits an expenditure by each candidate of $50,000, which sum is never exceeded in the statements statutorily required to be submitted to the Chief Election Officer, giving account of expenses incurred in the conduct of the election campaign. And when and against that, it is blatantly obvious that enormous expenditure is incurred in media advertisements alone, financed by whomsoever unknown, in support of participants' candidature, there is more than a taint of strong corruption inhabiting our frail blood. The EBC is by constitutional mandate responsible for the conduct of free and fair elections. That is to say, elections in which voters are meant to exercise their own will and in which all the activities and procedures necessary for the operations leading to the events are free from the slightest tincture or feint of corruption, and concerning which the results of such elections are believable. If, therefore, elections are to be free and fair, the conditions, the environment, if you will, that are necessary for creation of such a state of affairs must be created. As concerns campaign financing, the provisions relating to election expenses in the ROP are very limited in scope. They were apparently designed with an emphasis on the administration of the expenses of individual candidates. The law is not suited to the factuality that elections are essentially contests between political parties, competing for voters across the electoral districts of an electoral area. This oversight has contributed much to the runaway state of affairs that exists today in the financing of elections, not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but in other Caribbean countries as well. The law addresses the expenditure of candidates, but not that of the parties, of whom the coffers of some seem to be as deep as the moho. The reality that political parties through whom monies can be channeled are not also required to submit financial statements to a supervising authority, just as candidates are required to do, discloses a major loophole in the law. A political party, being a corporate body, or a business if you prefer, which in fact is what it is, requires finance to conduct its internal affairs and to do what it exists to do, namely participate in elections with the objective of winning the popular vote. No one would deny that in today's world, a great deal of money is required by a political party to run an election campaign. Financial support is a fundamental and major component in the construct of any party's election campaign. As Pinto Duchinsky puts it, the financing of political life is a necessity, and therein lies the central and most important difficulty. I shall come back to this topic a little later on. However, let me make the point here and now that it is the uncontrolled, if you like, unregulated flow of money into election campaigns that has the potential to distort and to reduce adult suffrage to the status of a monumental farce. In order to preserve the integrity of the system while at the same time acknowledging that agencies or individuals external to the party may contribute funds towards its activities, it would seem that to satisfy any criterion of transparency requires a disclosure of the source of the funds, especially so in the case of significant donations or contributions. Financial statements of both political parties and candidates should therefore include naming of the source of funds. The urge of political parties to obtain campaign funds and the gains some contributors anticipate from their donations spawn a multitude of practices that lead to contamination and corruption of the electoral process, thereby distorting democracy and, by extension, governance of the state. Electoral representatives becoming the alter egos of monopoly capitalists and other assorted mountebanks. Can elections conducted in a free-for-all campaign, free-for-all of campaign financing, be regarded as free and fair? Examination of a sample of real campaign funding scandals, including corruption, as reported in the literature, reveals a wide variety of methodologies, some of which are use for political party purposes of money, that is, kickbacks obtained by means of corrupt transactions, such as inflated government contracts. Unauthorized use of state resources, such as transport facilities and equipment in the conduct of political campaigns. Use of funds obtained from defendants accused of corrupt practices in return for avoidance of prosecution or corrupted judgments in legal entanglements with the state. Use of money obtained in the form of bribes from local or foreign companies for favors such as grant of concessions and licenses. Use of money obtained in advance in anticipation of an exchange of favors when a representative obtains office. And vote buying by treating and by the grant of a variety of favors. In Trinidad and Tobago, election agents or political candidates are required by law to submit to the chief election officer not later than 42 days after the result of an election is declared what is termed a true return. They are supposed to submit a true return of election expenses, which is to be accompanied by supporting bills and receipts. In addition, the return must be accompanied by a declaration made by the election agent before a justice of the peace. Further, the chief election officer in turn must, within 10 days of receipt of the election agent's statement and declaration, publish it in at least one newspaper, and a summary of the turn accompanying that, with an open invitation for its inspection by the general public. Unfortunately, however, the EBC's department does not have the expertise to either review and audit such statements or to investigate any violations. In any case, and in the interest of transparency, it would perhaps have been more appropriate to provide for such review and audit to be done and published by an independent agency. Thus far, I have drawn attention to deficiencies militating against transparency in the Representation of the People's Act as they relate to campaign expenditure, and in this regard, to attributes very likely to strengthen current legislation, namely, 1, full disclosure, both by political parties and candidates, of the sources and flow of finance in the conduct of the administration and management of election campaigns. 2, inclusion in the provisions relating to disclosure requirements of potent sanctions for either non-compliance or willful submission of incorrect information. And 3, auditing by appropriately qualified independent professionals of all financial statements submitted by political parties and candidates, and the publication of findings of such audits and any investigation associated therewith. To continue, as you are all aware, there have been 3 parliamentary debates in Trinidad and Tobago on the subject of campaign financing. One in the Law House, initiated in October 2006, 2 in the Senate, namely one in February 2009 and the other in November 2013. In the latter debate, which is still in progress, it was suggested by one of the senators that public funding in the form of state resources to political parties and candidates be considered in whatever legislative construct is eventually devised. It is axiomatic that political parties required money in order to maintain their organizations and to participate in elections. Direct and indirect public funding, which are not uncommon in a host of democratic countries, excluding significantly all of the Anglophone Caribbean, as far as I'm aware, except, of course, CPI, which Sir David spoke about this morning. According to a study entitled Political Finance Regulations Around the World, published by the Institute of Democracy and Electoral Assistance, IDA, 68% of 116 countries out of 180 surveyed have provisions for direct public funding of political parties. In this same study, it was pointed out that the data obtained revealed that in designing a system of state funding of political parties, 3 important questions need to be addressed, namely, firstly, which political party should be eligible to receive funds? Secondly, how should the available funds be allocated between eligible parties? Thirdly, are some or all of the funds earmarked for a particular purpose or purposes? The answers to these questions depend on established criteria for determination of eligibility based on, say, the number of registered party members, proportion of candidates contesting elections in relation to total number of electoral districts, and parliamentary representation, to name a few. Similarly, in respect of allocation of funds to parties deemed to be eligible, public funding may depend on the criterion of eligibility alone, so that equal amounts will be given to all parties. Also, the number of registered members in proportion to the total votes cast in elections and the proportion of seats received. In answering the third question, which relates to earmarking of funds by the state, an authority may consider whether it wants to allocate part of public funding for campaign purposes and part for non-electoral activities. Alternatively, Consideration could be given to earmarking such funding for such activities as civic education, psephological research, and introduction of gender development policies for strengthening the part that women play in the political life of the country. As mentioned earlier, government may wish also to provide indirect public funding by means of free or subsidized media access to political parties and their candidates. Other forms of indirect funding include tax relief for political parties or for the donors of such parties, provision of government premises, for example, schools for holding of political meetings, and free or subsidized transportation facilities. Such is the nature of direct and indirect political party financing by the state as it exists in the democratic world today, and as such should constitute a good backdrop against which we in Trinidad and Tobago could develop our own methodology. The issue of registration of political parties is, to my mind, highly correlated with campaign financing, especially in regard to proposals for state funding, whether direct or indirect. At the EBC Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute Symposium held last December on the topic of registration of political parties and campaign financing, jointly sponsored by the Canadian High Commission and the UNDP Development Program. UNDP's representative is right at my right hand here today, and in which the Organization of American States participated. I drew attention to the absence of a juridical definition of the term political party in the laws of Trinidad and Tobago, and adduced as evidence in support of a proposal for registration of political parties the incidents involving certain political parties which occurred during the run-up to the general elections of 2001 and 2007, the former matter having to be decided in the court. Clearly, the call for registration would be bolstered by any proposals for accessing state funding, since eligibility criteria, including such a requirement, would need to be established. At present, any lunatic can declare that he or she is a political party and write to the EBC requesting registration of a symbol. Production of a symbol costs time and money, and most of the time such parties do not contest an election anyhow. At this stage, it may fairly be concluded that the case has been made out for review of the ROP to make provision for full disclosure both by political parties and candidates of their election expenses as disclosed in their financial statements submitted to the Commission's department, and to have such statements audited by an independent external auditor, independent investigators appointed to report on any violation, and all audited statements published for public consumption, also with disclosure of all sources of funding and the path along which funding monies within the party's organization. The issue of direct and indirect state funding of political parties was broached, in which connection attention was drawn to the essential elements to be considered in the design of any plan based on such allocation of funds and the different types of allocation and eligibility criteria. Cogent argument was made in support of requirements in the law for the registration of political parties. I elaborated on this at the symposium last December. And at that symposium, to which I referred earlier, the question was asked, what happens next? Well, in the days immediately following the National Symposium, the Commission held confidential bilateral consultations with this country's major political parties. The topics of the registration of political parties, political financing, and the methods in which these reforms could be achieved were broached with each party. I'm happy to share with you that unanimously the political parties demonstrated conceptual support for the introduction of legislation governing registration of political parties and the establishment of public funding for political parties, although it was noted that the details of the data would require extensive work. In the upcoming weeks, the Commission intends to engage in further bilateral consultations with the political parties. The purpose of these talks is the acquisition of statistical data at this stage from the political parties as to their contribution amounts and expenditure so as to identify realistic sources of income, contribution caps, and expenditure limits. These data are essential for the creation of any future enforceable legislation governing political finance. A key matter for deliberation during these discussions will be whether corporate contributions to political parties should be banned altogether. We know that when making donations to political parties, corporations are not being selfless. A usual goal is often to secure government contracts. It has been said time and time again that corporate money has no morals and hence no loyalty to any other goal other than maximizing profits. As such, awarding contracts for political reasons can lead to systemic corruption and the inefficient allocation of public resources. I anticipate that this debate shall be interesting to say the least. We are going to be holding these discussions with political parties very soon, and we are going to be assisted in this by a former head of the election body in Canada. Forging ahead, the Commission intends to develop political finance reform proposals. These proposals will be submitted to the political parties, civil society, and the public at large for comment, and thereafter to the government for action. It is hoped that by virtue of this methodology, a consensus as to the content of any future legislation governing political finance in Trinidad and Tobago can be attained. In the long run, the question is whether the political will is there to implement these changes, these reforms. Within the Caribbean region, the efforts of the Electoral Commission of Jamaica towards the monitoring and regulation of campaign financing stand out as a beacon of hope. In a report to Parliament dated in July 2010, the Jamaican Commission recommended that Parliament amend the Representation of the People's Act to include the registration and the financing of political parties. And in November 2011, another report was submitted by the Commission to Parliament on campaign financing, arising from the comments and opinions of members of the House of Representatives and the Senate as expressed in the parliamentary debates. The Electoral Commission of Jamaica prepared another report dated August 2013 with revised recommendation to its report on campaign financing. It appears, therefore, that Jamaica may be the first country, but perhaps this is not quite true based on what the previous speaker said, Sir David Simmons, in respect of registration of political parties and financing of political parties. Trinidad and Tobago must follow. If we fail to address the ominous issue of money in politics, a handful of special interests will dominate political funding, and big money will continue to erode our system of governance and the sacred name of democracy parodied before the altar of Croesus. In the free society ordained by our Constitution, it is not the government, but the people individually as citizens and candidates, and collectively as associations and political committees, who must create active change in the thorny subject of electoral financing reform. If the nature of politics is that politicians must be beholden to their contributors, then let their contributors be mainly from the public by way of public funding. And so a vote according to the will of their largest contributors would be a vote for the good of the people. Remember, money in politics is scary, but some money is definitely scarier than others. I would like to say at this point that the questions of registration of political parties and their funding of political parties, these were matters that I presented to the Constitution Forum. I went myself and I made these presentations. And, you know, to me, based on the report that they submitted, these things were completely ignored. I made the point that these matters should be included in our Constitution. A Constitution, a document, you know, which really sets out how the framework of governance of a country is set out in its Constitution. It's like a building. You go and you have a look at a beautiful building and you see the architecture, and that tells you something about the building. By a similar token, I think that when we put these things, the registration of political parties and the financing of campaigns, you don't have to put the law into the Constitution. What you have to do is to say that you are the country, you know, is concerned about it and wants its political parties to be registered and wants to be able to control campaign financing. These things ought to have been included, but they were simply ignored. In conclusion, I leave you with a scriptural reflection taken from John chapter 1, verse 23. John says to the prophet Isaiah, I am the voice of one calling in the wilderness, make straight for the way of the Lord. Be assured, colleagues, until the day of change dawns, the EBC, together with you as partner in democracy, shall be such a voice advocating for the improvement of this country's democracy, making straight the way for the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. I thank you very much.